Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the webinar of today. This afternoon, the webinar will talk about the role of standardization in supporting biodiversity and the related EU legislation. It will also include an explanation on the nature restoration law. So my name is Els and I will be moderating the webinar in the background. By default, you're all muted, so you cannot speak out loud, but we do invite you to submit your questions via the Q&A panel of this Zoom webinar. Should you be on X. You're always free to talk about the topic with the hashtag training for standards, and you can find Sen and Senelec via @standards4EU. So without further ado, I would like to give the floor right away to our first speaker. We have the pleasure to have with us today Benjamin Casper from the DG Environment of the European Commission, who will talk us through the regulation in relation to biodiversity. So please, Benjamin, the floor is yours.
Hi, thanks very much. I'm just going to share my screen, but for some reason I can't see this screen sharing. Ah, yes, here it is, share screen, crazy. Right, I'm going to put it on full screen and you tell me, that's okay?
This is okay.
This is okay. Okay, perfect. Thanks very much. Well, my name's Ben Casper. I've worked for the European Commission in DG Environment. I've been with the European Commission for 24 years, and I work in the Biodiversity Directorate in a unit called Natural Capital and Ecosystem Health. Not 100% sure why it's called that. It used to be called the Biodiversity Unit, but because they changed the whole name to Directorate to Biodiversity, they decided to change our name as well. Anyway, I've been working for the last 5 years on the Biodiversity Strategy for 2030 and then on the Nature Restoration Regulation, which I'm very happy to say is now in force. So I'm just going to talk through a little bit. I think I've only got about 20 minutes. So I'm going to speak. I'll have to go through quite quickly. I don't know if there's going to be then some time for questions. But anyway, I'm going to give an introduction to why we have the Nature Restoration Regulation. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the negotiations quite quickly, and then I'll talk about the regulation itself. And I would try and think a little bit about, of course, how this relates to standardization. But I think that's going to be what carries on in the rest of this webinar. We'll be talking a little bit about how you use standardization to support biodiversity policy in general. So the first thing I wanted to talk about was some of the arguments for nature restoration. Hopefully the people watching this webinar will be a bit aware of this already. We're maybe not preaching, I'm now preaching to the converted, but we have a lot of discussions about whether we need to restore nature or not. Personally, as a biologist and someone who's been working in environment for a long time, I think it's pretty obvious. But I think these are just some of the arguments we use during the negotiation process, and they're in our impact assessment as well, because for every regulation you have to have a full impact assessment. That was 2 or 3 years ago now. The first thing is that our nature, even in Europe, is not in a fantastic state. You'll see here it says only 14% of habitats are in a favourable status. You'll get a copy of these slides. You can click on the links and you can see these in a bit more detail. We also feel that restoring nature is part and parcel of the same fight on climate change as well. So with the European Green Deal over the last 5 years, we saw that it was recognized that restoring nature and biodiversity was part of the same challenge as climate change, not something completely separate. Biodiversity is not something nice to have. It's actually really an important part of this fight for climate change and biodiversity. They're sort of one in the same problem and they feed on each other. So actually, we've seen a decrease in our carbon sinks. And nature is, of course, a fantastic carbon sink. Wetlands, forests, obviously, 30% drop in EU natural carbon sinks since 2010. Actually, nature is connected to our food system as well. And actually, some people say the opposite, that restoring nature is a risk to our food system. It's completely the opposite. If you have good nature, you have good soils, you have good climate regulation, and actually it decreases the risk of crop failure. We have also you'll be aware that there's a risk of flooding, and if you have a restored nature, we feel that it's very good to reduce flood risk, and of course in cities it helps reduce the heat as well. And this final slide, this final point, 72% of EU companies highly dependent on at least one ecosystem service. I mean, I think 100% of EU companies are dependent on all of our ecosystem services. I mean, we've come from nature and we are part of nature. So I'm not sure I would even go that far. The EU proposal for nature regulation on nature restoration came about 4 or 5 years ago. And it was really a recognition that although we've protected some areas in Europe, quite a lot of areas, I think when we produced the biodiversity strategy, it was 18% of land and 8% of marine areas were protected. And the biodiversity strategy sets a target to increase this area to 30% and 30%. But that's not enough. We actually realize that we need to do some nature restoration as well. In the 2020 biodiversity strategy, we set targets which were voluntary, and none of them were met. So we decided to do something different this time and set legally binding targets for nature restoration. So the regulation applies directly. It's been in force since the 18th of August. Doesn't need to be transposed. It builds on existing policies, the nature directives, water framework directive, etc. And it's part of all of these. The negotiations, I've just got a few slides here, but the negotiations were really tough. This was an extremely, I would say, like a lot of regulations, but this was particularly controversial. We saw at the beginning of the Green Deal, there was quite a lot of momentum behind developing new environmental policy. By the end of the Green Deal term, the last commission, so earlier this year, there was a lot less momentum, let's say. We've been through the pandemic. Financial times are hard. The farmers were worried about their future, and so the nature restoration regulation was really under threat. In fact, I worked on this for all these years, and I thought that it was dead. We had got through, I mean, about 20 different times we had to have these big negotiations, these big votes in Parliament, in Council. We were at the edge of our seats thinking, is it going to survive or not? And it just managed to scrape through each time. But then, even after the trilogue, where the Commission, the European Parliament and the Council had all agreed a final text, it was supposed to be a rubber stamping exercise. We found that one member state changed their position. This was Hungary, and we realized we could no longer get this through in a final vote. So for 6 months, we thought it was lost. And then at the last minute, we had Austria changed their position. It says here, rogue Austrian minister burns bridges to save EU nature restoration law. These were some of the things which were said, that effectively, regardless of what really happened, Austria changed their position. So the legislative process went from June 2022, when we made our first proposal, to August 2024. It felt like about 100 years for me, but in fact, yes, I just see here it was only 2 years for that part, and it's now in force. So we have a new regulation on nature restoration. It is groundbreaking. It has been very well received when we go to global negotiations on the same topic. It is in some ways still very ambitious. In other ways, during the negotiation process, it was softened a bit from our original proposal, but not in all. In others, it was strengthened. All in all, it's a fantastic framework for developing and improving the state of our ecosystems. Here's an overview slide. It has an overarching objective, which is very ambitious, that 20% of EU land and sea need to have measures which are restoring their ecosystems by 2030, and all ecosystems in need of restoration should have measures in place by 2050. The regulation sets targets and obligations. It has an implementation framework, which I think is probably the area where lots of new measurement and monitoring systems are going to be put in place. That could be very interesting for standardization. And there is a financing framework as well, which is part of the whole new, should be part of the next multi-annual financial framework of the EU. Yeah, okay, so here I think this slide tells you a lot about what you need to know about the EU nature restoration regulation. It's very broad. It covers all of these different ecosystems, and in a way it could have been presented as 3 or 4 different regulations, but we put everything into one. So it's quite a big beast. It's got quite a lot of detail to it. I'm going to talk through some of these very briefly. If you want more details, it's very easy to find online, and we are actually going to produce a brochure in the next few weeks, which goes through each of these in an easy way, because reading the regulation is quite complicated. I have to be honest, I'm the expert on the urban ecosystem. I'm not such an expert on some of the others, so I apologize if my explanation isn't super precise. This is not my slide. This is the slide of the person who works on this one. I just spoke to them to try and get a bit more detail about how to explain this. It's quite complicated because this one and the next one, the marine ecosystems, these 2 articles in the regulation, they build on an existing regulation, the Birds and Habitats Directives and the Marine Framework Directive. And so their relationship with those is to try and integrate into them and try and improve and strengthen them. So it's a little bit complicated. I'll just quickly go through it. This covers Annex 1 habitats under the Habitats Directive. It also covers the habitats of species. So these are 2, they both have the word habitat in, but they're slightly different things. One is habitat types, and the other is where certain species live. And both of those have measures in place under the Habitats Directive, but they're not time-bound. And so in some senses, they've not been binding. Now they are. They're time-bound, and that's going to make all the difference. It covers over 230 habitats in 7 groups, and it does various things within those groups, which one is to improve to good condition areas not in good condition, and of the areas which are not in good condition, at least 30% have measures in place by 2030, and then by 2050 it's 90%. So all of your habitat types and habitats of species which are not in good condition by 2050 have to have measures in place to take them towards good condition. You also have some situations where habitats have shrunk over recent years, and those habitats have to be re-established. Essentially, they will have to grow back again. So if you have forests which have disappeared under the Habitats Directive, by 2050, that amount of forest that's disappeared will have to have doubled. So re-establishment to reach favourable reference areas. There are rules on restoration of habitats of species. So where the other rules do not apply, you'll have to improve the quality, quantity, and connectivity in the habitats of species. There is a lot of work to do on filling, knowledge gap filling. So all the groups, basically we have a problem is that in some member states, we actually don't know the condition of some of these habitats, and they haven't properly been mapped. So that's going to happen as well. Obviously, these things are quite dependent on each other, and they will influence each other. So that's going to take place over the coming years. And this says non-significant deterioration. This means, in fact, it should say no significant deterioration. There is a requirement that those areas which are in good condition can't get worse. There are derogations I'm not going to have time to go into now. There is a similar set of measures for marine ecosystems building on the Marine Framework Directive. I'm not going to go into the detail here, but again, you'll see you need to go improvement to good condition of areas not in good condition, re-establishment to reach favourable status for certain reference areas, restorations of habitats of species, knowledge gap filling. So it's the same process for marine. That's Article 5. There was quite a lot of controversy over the marine one as well, and we had real fights and difficulties for each of these different ecosystems. This is my baby, the urban ecosystem target. A little bit easier to write out. Anyway, there should be no net loss of urban green space at national level by 2030, and after that there will be an increasing trend until a satisfactory level is reached, and the same for tree canopy cover. So essentially, this is quite groundbreaking. It means in all cities and in all towns and suburbs, urban ecosystem areas will be defined by member states, and then they will have to measure and monitor the green space and trees in those to stop any loss, and in the future to increase towards a satisfactory level. This satisfactory level has not yet been agreed what it is or how it's measured or monitored. So, well, monitored is easy. You can do it from space with satellite data, but deciding what a satisfactory level is has not yet been agreed. That's going to happen between now and the end of 2028. There's a target on river connectivity to say that we have to remove artificial barriers which are no longer of use, and have at least 25,000 kilometres of free-flowing rivers by 2030. Less specific targets for each member state than their previous articles. Pollinators is, again, of a slightly different nature from the others. It was strengthened, actually, during the negotiations. It says we have to reverse the decline in pollinator populations by 2030 and improve pollinator diversity. So member states have to show how they're going to do this, and I'll talk about that a little bit in a minute on their national restoration plans, which they have to make. They have to increase after 2030 an increasing trend for pollinator populations until, again, a satisfactory level is reached, measured every 6 years. We haven't defined what the satisfactory level is yet. So that's something that takes place between now and 2030. A lot of this is about new monitoring protocols and measurement protocols. Annual, standardized, and representative. You'll see the word standardized there. Everyone's ears are pricking up, getting excited. That is a process that's now underway, talking about how this monitoring takes place and how it can be standardized. Science-based monitoring method to be established by delegated act. So in the regulation, various different things are agreed by what's called a comitology procedure, quite official. The Commission make a proposal and it goes through and is voted by member states. Yeah. Agricultural ecosystems, I'm not the expert on this at all. It was at one stage during the negotiations removed entirely. Then it was brought back in. It's about enhancing the biodiversity of agricultural ecosystems. They look at indicators of agricultural ecosystem health, They have to look at the 2 out of the 3 of the grassland butterfly index, stock organic carbon, and the share of high diversity landscape features. We've just made a proposal to define what high diversity landscape features are. I wasn't involved in that, but essentially it's things like bushes and shrubs and hedgerows and woody features, areas of longer grass, etc. There are also targets in here on restoring peatlands and re-wetting wetlands, which historically are amazing carbon sinks. They were often drained and then they're used as agricultural land because they're so rich. And actually, if you re-wet them, drained peatlands, etc., you can actually very quickly use them as an effective carbon sink. They're also amazing for biodiversity. Forest ecosystems, there are indicator-based targets. So you have the Common Forest Bird Index, and then 6 out of these 7 indicators have to be taken, and those indicators have to show an improvement over time. I think here there is an opportunity for thinking that there might be some opportunities for standardization. Standing deadwood, lying deadwood, share of forest with uneven age structure, etc. How do you measure these? Is there a standard? How do you agree it? How do you compare between different countries, different forests, different climatic regions? So there's a lot there. There's a lot of work ongoing as a result of this regulation. I think we can skip the planting of 3 billion additional trees. It's not really a binding target in the same way as the others, but it's good that it's in there because it encourages member states to report on how they're doing in achieving this overarching target of the biodiversity strategy. Now, which one of these should I? Those are the different ecosystems. You'll see that each one is treated very differently. They have different types of targets. They have different areas of expertise. Some are very measured and measurable. Like on urban ecosystems, we know how much green space and tree canopy cover there is already across Europe. In some of the other ecosystems, the knowledge of the condition of them is not so good. So there's a lot of reporting, monitoring, measuring, knowledge gathering that needs to go on. And there are half of the regulation covers these. It's all based on this national restoration plans. So in the next few years, member states have to look at each of these ecosystems, and they have some reporting obligations to say how they're going to make sure that they restore the ecosystems in these different areas. It's linked to then financing, but at the moment, we're really in negotiations with forming a standardized template for member states saying exactly what it is they have to fill in. We're discussing it with them. They have to choose their indicators, what areas they're going to be doing, and then there's a reporting cycle. The whole process is done with the European Environment Agency. They will be the main measuring and monitoring body working with us on this. The key actions are this uniform format. That's what we're doing at the moment. We've just put that into inter-service consultation. Then there are going to be, next year, member states will come with their draft national restoration plans. We give them feedback and assess them 2027. And then in August 2027, these national restoration plans will be finalized. So yeah, it's a very exciting time for me, having thought that I wouldn't have any work to do. Now we have all these different levels and these things which we're going through. If you're interested, these slides will be available for you. What's the financing? The first thing about financing is that every study we've looked at and looked into that's been in any detail has found that the benefits of restoring nature far outweigh the costs. We use this number, I would take it with a pinch of salt, but every €1 spent on restoration returns investment of at least 8. That's in our impact assessment. We looked at many studies. We found numbers higher than this. This was smaller, but this was the average. Often it's very difficult to monetize the benefits of nature restoration. Things like mental and physical well-being. Often the studies look at just one thing. So they look at flood risk reduction of say, trees in a city, but it doesn't look at the fact that the city trees cool down the city as well. So I think probably the true impact of nature restoration is bigger. One thing I do know is that if you destroy all your nature, you're going to destroy your economy as well. We estimated at the time it needed 6 to 8 billion per year to fund the different actions and put the measures in place to restore nature. The multi-annual financial framework of the European Commission says that from next year onwards, 10% of the entire budget should be available for biodiversity. That's not direct spending. It means that some other spending could be beneficial for biodiversity as well. So it's greening existing spending as well as having dedicated funding for nature restoration. Yeah, I think that's probably all I'm going to say. This whole thing forms part of our international obligations, but I don't think we need to necessarily talk about that now. But maybe it's something that might be relevant for international standards as well, and maybe we should think about some of the different protocols, measuring systems we put in place. If they were standardized, then that would help with measuring and monitoring and reporting at an international level as well. So maybe that's something to think about. Thanks for your attention. That's, I think, my presentation. Hope you can still hear me. I haven't had any feedback for a while.
Yes, thank you, Ben. We heard you well.
Okay.
I think a few questions came in, by the way. So if you can have a look and maybe, if possible, reply a few of them already, that would be fine.
I will do. Do you want me to reply?
Well, maybe in a written way because we
I
need
can do
to
that
stick
in
to
writing,
the
although I
time.
can't see
Under Q&A, you should be able to see them.
webinar chat. I can just see the hosts and panelists at the moment, but I'm sure I can.
Well, if not, we can always take them offline, of course, after the webinar. I will share with all the speakers the questions that came in anyway. But we need to stick to the timing. So if it's okay for you, we go over to the next speaker. If I'm not mistaken, I can now give the floor to Christina, my colleague at Sansanlek, who is going to talk about how a standardization can support biodiversity. So please, Christina, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Els. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you to Benjamin for this very interesting overview of the nature restoration law. Super interesting. Okay, so I will obviously speak from a standardization perspective. So I'm Christina Thorngreen. I work as a project manager for Sen and Senelec. I cover various different sectors, and I work in the energy and living unit. And so today I'll try and make the link a bit more with standardization. Let's see if I can get this into proper presentation mode. There we go. Okay. So firstly, just an introduction for those who don't know. So SEN is the European Committee on Standardization. We then also have SENELEC, which is everything to do with electrotechnology, and ETSI, which is telecommunications. SEN and SENELEC are based in Brussels, and ETSI is based in Nice. And these three are the officially recognized European standardization organizations by EU Regulation 1025. So SEN and SENELEC are made up of their national members, which are for SEN, national standards bodies, and in SENELEC, they are called national committees. And these are also members of ISO and IC, which are the international counterparts for SEN and SENELEC. Just going back to what Benjamin hinted at earlier with international standardization, I should say, I take this opportunity to say that in our cooperation with our international counterparts, international level always has primacy, as we say. So we give priority to having a global standard. and we do cooperate very closely to avoid any duplication of resources and of standards, of course. Yeah, just to explain that. Now I'm already moving forward to basically some of the upcoming topics potentially that SEN will look at in terms of standardization. So there's a document called the Annual Union Work Programme, which comes out every year. It's informally, I could like to call it the sort of wish list for standardization from the European Commission. And I thought it would be interesting to bring up this one action here, 56. I know it's not super easy to read as it's just a screenshot, so I put the source here. I put the link to where you can read this online. But yes, this action 56 from last year's work program is indeed on soil health measurement and access, and it is based on or will be based on, let's say, if we receive a request for this, an official request, on the soil monitoring law, which, from what I understood, will soon come into force. And the idea here is to develop a digital soil health data portal, which would then provide access to soil health data, and that in turn would require the development of new European standards to harmonize the measuring of, among other things, electrical conductivity, soil water holding capacity, soil basal respiration, metabar coding of bacteria, fungi, protists, and animals in soil, diversity of nematodes, microbial biomass, abundance of diversity of earthworms in soil, but also concentration of contaminants such as pesticides, microplastics, and PFAS. So a host of deliverables that could come from this request, which at the moment is still a work in progress, let's say. Then we also received a preliminary annual union work program for next year, and this is also available online to the public. And this will be in support of a regulation. This is still a proposal, which will address the assessment of ecosystem services. And here, again, the idea is to develop at least a standard or several deliverables, which will be distinct from financial and statistical standards in order to support the assessment of ecosystem services. And so that would underpin the reporting on biodiversity, climate change, and the health of terrestrial and marine ecosystems. And we are at the moment, we're checking to see which of the existing SEN committees that we have might be best placed to lead this work. And so with that in mind, I wanted to very kind of superficially present the technical committees, technical bodies that we have, existing ones that do work in support of biodiversity. So we have, firstly, CEN/TC 444 on environmental characterization of solid matrices. And their scope is the standardization of methods for the environmental characterization of soil, solid and liquid waste, biowaste, and sludge. We have CEN/TC 467 on climate change, and this TC, also quite recent, will address standardization in the field of mitigation and adaptation to climate change, including related social and economic aspects. And then, if I can move forward. Here we go. Also, a fairly recent committee, CEN/TC 474, is on carbon dioxide capture, transportation, utilization, and storage, so CCUS for short. And this committee will develop standards covering the full life cycle of CCUS projects, regulate stream composition and quality, as well as the work on risk management, health, and environmental aspects. And then finally, we have also a very new committee, CEN/TC 475, Finance. It might seem like the odd one out, but in fact, it will work on standardization in the field of course, finance, but also including sustainable finance. And at the moment, this might actually be the committee that will lead the work on the assessment of ecosystem services, because they're going to be looking at the monetary value of ecosystems, and so they might be best placed to develop these reporting standards. And that was my very short kind of link to standardization. And I thank you for your attention, and we'll be happy to answer any questions in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina. I give the floor to Caroline Huillery, who is from AFNOR and also has an important role in the TC and ISO TC in relation to biodiversity. Caroline, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. Thank you all. I will just bring my complete. Yeah, I think it's okay. Thank you, Benjamin and Christina, for your presentation. Thank you for the framework that have been set up. I am Caroline Huillery, the committee manager of the International Committee on Biodiversity, the ISO TC 331, which is led by France with AFNOR as the secretariat. I also like to say that I'm in charge of several working groups level at the ISO level on soil field, with their links with the climate change and ecosystem services. Today, in line with Benjamin, Christina, and Sami's presentation, I will highlight the way in which the technical committee is mobilized on biodiversity, and in particular in support of the restoration theme. How the technical committee considers restoration and renaturation, and how it addresses it in certain ongoing projects and approaches. The issue of restoration is clearly included at the international level through the 30+30 target of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, and also the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. So we will therefore go for a quick look at the COP16, which will held in Cali in Colombia last October, in order to highlight the points of attention for the technical committee and for renaturation aspect. And finally, we will end the ambition of the technical committee to take the biodiversity variable beyond its own borders by working closely with other technical committee and organization, and how the European level is an essential and strategic level to catch. So let's start first with the resources mobilized within ISO TC 331, with an overview of the members participating within the technical committee. We have 43 P members and 21 LRP members as participating members, meaning with a voting right, one member country, one vote, and 21 observing members. We can see that all continents and biomes are concerned. We have also international and European organization in liaison with our technical committee. Here mention the first organization to be liaised with the technical committee 331, which is IUCN, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, since the beginning, when setting the first step of technical committee 331. I will also mention the last one, the fourth on nature-related financial disclosures, the TNFDs, which will be was in line with discussion during the COP16 in Montreal, and then giving opportunities to intervention of the technical committee during this COP16 in Colombia. And also another strategic liaison, ECOS, presented here today by Sami Porteron, which is very deeply involved in some projects within our technical committee. Here, I will remind that the technical committee was created in June 2020, so quite a recent one. Since then, we have set up 4 working groups, which we can see in the green boxes. Resources behind those 4 working groups are the experts mandated by the participating countries and the organization that we can find again at the bottom of the screen. So we have also the 4 working groups are led by representatives for different countries, And we have the work program, which is within the blue dotted frame, meaning those projects which are held by a development schedule, an average of 3 years for the development of a project. And there we can see that there are also many projects discussed still at the proposal stage that we can see in the light red boxes. If we are looking a little bit deeper on the current projects, here they are. Highlighted with the purple boxes are the standard projects that will support in some way restoration law. So we have the essential one, I mean the basic line on terminology. It's in order to have a common language, which is so important in our work. The vocabulary is being defined through the project, which is under ballot until February next year, but it's a never-ending project. What is restoration? What is restoration, for example? So it's some kind of thing to be discussed at the ISO level. We have also the project on biodiversity net gain, which is at the project level, interesting for infrastructure developers, landscapers. We have the project on ecological corridors, which is a vast literature and needs review, which is underway through the technical committee. Within the working group 2, also, we needed to take the working group 2 on measurement data assessments. We needed to take a step aside. The purpose of the umbrella task force is to carry out a state of the art, the existing and the gaps. So we are conducting now a work on the comprehensive review and categorization of methodologies for measuring, monitoring, and assessing biodiversity. If we dive a little deeper into the heart of the COP16, the 16th Conference of the Parties of the Convention on Biological Diversity, how is positioned today within this very rich international ecosystem. So ISO TC31 was present through a small delegation. We were accredited through ISO as observers, but it was the first time for ISO to be part of such an event. The participation of TC31 followed its participation in the COP15 in Montreal, where we had the opportunity to organize side events to highlight the importance of ISO standards. And during this one, the COP16 in Cali, in Colombia, several interventions took place and numerous bilateral meetings also were held. I will insist on a momentum just before the COP16 was the publication of an ISO mapping highlighting the ISO standards concerned and the essential roles in aligning and supporting the global biodiversity target. More than 500 relevant standards were identified across 94 technical committees, which is a huge number. Here, very shortly, the main result and perspective from the COP16, in particular in relation to the issue of renaturation. The major of COP16 complement the implementation mechanism of the global biodiversity target, 3 per 30 per 30, and are also in line with the renaturation approach. Very quickly, the establishment of the process to identify ecologically or biologically significant marine area, which is based mainly on new mechanism to identify them. Those areas accompany the achievement of the 30% strategic target and prepare also for the future implementation of the new agreement on marine biodiversity beyond national jurisdictions. Sustainable wildlife management is at stake also, with the need for monitoring, the need for capacity building and inclusive participation of indigenous people, local communities and women. To this end, cooperation is called with the CITES, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, and also with FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, The theme also of sustainable wildlife question the interconnection between wildlife use, biodiversity loss, and zoonotic disease. In this line, there is finally the launch of One Health action plan, considering that biodiversity loss and poor health often share common factors, such as deforestation, pollution, climate change. There is a link to the need to educate and promote understanding of the links between biodiversity and health, or to promote also policies that reduce habitat destructions. They look at strengthening close collaboration with international organizations, including the World Health Organization, the International Organization for Epizooty. There is also the alignment with the 16th meeting of the Conference of the Party to the UN Convention to combat desertification. This COP, which is not so well known, it starts today in Riyadh, in Saudi Arabia, until December 13. A short recall here of the 30/30 target and the place of Europe and the restoration law in support of this 30/30 target of the Kunming-Montreal, but also on the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, which is run until 2030. Here is how EU restoration law is aligned with the 30% target. We have the restoration target covering critical habitat. European law imposes legally binding target for the restoration of terrestrial, marine, aquatic, and urban habitat, which are in line. Strengthening also the effective protection of restored areas. European law encourages the prior restoration of degraded areas before designating them as protected, increasing then their ecological value. There is also the focus on ecological connectivity, or also the inclusion of marine ecosystems. So we can say that the ISO TC 331 is integrating these COP16 result, but also trying to align with what we have at the EU level, such as this restoration law. And what we can say that ISO committee adopted a proactive posture to address biodiversity issues. The challenge of TC 331 was outlined in a document called Amazonas Position Paper, because it was drafted and validated during the last plenary session we had in Manaus in Brazil in last May. Biodiversity ensures ecosystem stability and human survival. So there is a need also to move from a silo approach to a systematic one, mixing a collaborative and competitive construction. When we get to the heart of the ISO system, we have and can rely on resources potential. So all stakeholders from NGO, research, private and public are part of the work. And we look at a collaborative and competitive construction that foster innovation with the capacity also to address regional issues. And finally, with our objective as technical committee, targeting the 5 major pressure factors on biodiversity. ISO Global Network has a unique role in addressing these challenges. Now, how does it work? How to address such issues? Reminding firstly that ISO system is a network used by several million companies across 171 countries. That there is a catalog of 28,000 standards. They have been developed over decades. We have some very important ones that are a lot known over the world, the ISO 14001 or the ISO 26000. So the ISO TC new positioning, what does this mean in concrete terms for the technical committee? There is a new reading of the strategic issues that are including in this Amazonas position paper, which means new challenges. So Our mission, the creation of specific biodiversity standards, the gaps and subject not currently covered, the work ongoing, which has been slightly presented before. But behind this mission, we propose a transversal approach to equip the existing standards, which are managed by other technical committees, with the main objectives to accelerate the consideration of biodiversity and standardization work in collaboration with other technical committees for concrete and massive results by focusing on the most used standards which can be tooled by integrating the biodiversity variable. So collaboration, this is a working capacity to be partly rethink in very close collaboration with the technical committee who develop the standards identified as being the most used and likely to integrate the biodiversity variable. We can have the ISO 31 on risk management, for example, the ISO 22000 on the food safety management system. Quite a lot to explore. So the four main strategic action from the Amazonas position paper, it's just a repeat, a bit repetitive of what I said before, but to create new biodiversity specific standard, to equip existing standards with biodiversity variable criteria, to foster inclusion, and also to modernize ISO's model to align with biodiversity needs. So it's a lot to do. And in our own capacity as a committee manager of a technical committee and in line with the other committee manager and all the stakeholders within those committee, there is a capacity for mobilization and collaboration, which is at stake. It is based on existing liaison. So here we have the internal ones, the technical committee with access to the document of our technical committee. We have also the internal liaison allowing our technical committee to access the document of the following of the other technical committee. And also the external liaison that I was presented before with the international and European organization, with IUCN, TNFD, ECOS, for instance. Here, this is this map. I like the context and liaison that ISO TC 31 has established with other technical committee, with areas of cross interest, namely standards that have been identified, but still to be identified and confirmed to push the biodiversity variable. It's an important work to be taken for tomorrow. And at the same level, we had exchanges with the CEN-TC 268 on sustainable cities. We have a liaison which has been established. And as well, we have exchange with the CEN-TC on water quality and DNA and eDNA methodology. This figure is to be continued and completed. So finally, the future of ISO TC 331, in order to have the strongest impact to infuse the biodiversity variable and renaturation, for instance, it's a question of counting on close collaboration with all stakeholders on a bottom-up approach. So TC 331 proposes itself for this at the central point of this collaboration at this international level, relying on the expertise mandated by the Mirror National Commission of the member countries, the local contribution inputs. And there is also the expertise mandated by all the organization in liaison. And there is a specific place for the European level, which is essential. Standardization can support European regulation, such as CSRD, the Nature Restoration Law, the Soil Monitoring Law, and or the Future Forest Monitoring Law. So where CEN can play a decisive role if there is a will to create a CEN-TC on biodiversity, which is still an open question. Yeah, thank you. Thank you all for your attention. I will be happy to answer your question.
Thank you, Caroline. For the moment, no questions. I don't think I see any questions in relation to your presentation. I would like to thank Christina and Ben for already replying the other questions. So questions might come in. Attendees still have time, of course, to submit their questions, so please go ahead. And then I would like to ask Sami Potteron from ECOS to share his screen so we can continue with your part of the presentation. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Els. Give me a second to set up. Okay. I think everyone should be able to see my screen now. So thanks everyone who has joined and is listening. My name is Sami Potteron. I'm Senior Program Manager at ECOS, working
Sami,
on...
we don't see your screen.
Okay, let me try again. That should work now. Does it?
Yes.
Okay, I just had
Yes,
not
that's better.
confirmed. Here we go. So I'm working specifically on bioeconomy and nature protection and restoration at ECOS. ECOS, to be brief, is an environmental NGO based in Brussels, but active internationally. We also have an office in Kenya, in Nairobi. And our specialty is that we work both on policy and on standards. We provide technical expertise to both EU policy processes as well as international agreement negotiations and technical committees from both SEN, ISO, SENELEC, and so on. We are a network organization, meaning we have members, about 55, which are other environmental NGOs active at national level or lower, or also at the EU level. And we also work directly with experts that support our work. So we're here today to discuss the nature restoration law and the rule of standards. And for civil society, the adoption of the nature restoration law was definitely an achievement. It's an important step towards restoring nature in the EU. As we heard already from Benjamin, the state of ecosystems in Europe is rather poor. And it takes a time to restore ecosystems. It can take years or decades, depending on what we're trying to achieve and the current state of the ecosystem. And the achievement of nature restoration objectives, meaning the implementation success of the nature restoration law, indeed does depend, at least in part, in gathering information about not only the current state of the ecosystem, but also how we're making progress and the impacts of the management practices that we're putting in place in order to restore these ecosystems. So that means that we need information in order to plan action, to implement effective management practices, and to continuously monitor the impacts and potentially adjust. And we've already heard quite a bit about this, but we've developed this diagram in order to illustrate the importance of ecosystems for their own resilience and health, but also for the health of people and of the economy. So what I mean by that is when we have healthy ecosystems, which means that there is a diversity of fauna and flora, microorganisms in the soil, and so on, then we will have what we call a healthy ecosystem, and meaning also a resilient ecosystem, that is an ecosystem that can sustain pressures, including those coming from climate change, like heat waves, droughts, floods, and so on. And these benefits also trickle down to our society, protecting communities living around ecosystems from flooding, but also providing some essential services to, for instance, agriculture. And we can think, for instance, as we heard also from Benjamin, if you plant hedges And trees, or if you have a forest near a farm, then the nutrient runoff from fertilization will be absorbed by the vegetation, and this will reduce eutrophication risks. It can also reduce floods risks and mitigate droughts because, as I'm sure you all know, trees absorb carbon, but they also release water through evapotranspiration, therefore cooling down the ambient air. They provide shade in cities, therefore overall helping to regulate the climate. Unfortunately, while there is this understanding in some circles, especially in expert circles related to ecosystems, this knowledge tends to not be so present in policy decision making. And this is where we think that the role of standard can be important, because the better we can collect information about ecosystem service provision and the importance of biodiversity in increasing the quality of ecosystem services, the better the choices that we can make at a policy level, but also from private sector in order to gear management practices towards increasing biodiversity and increasing ecosystem services. So this is really the opportunity that at ECOS we see for standardization. We have rather low available data and quality data about ecosystem, about their health and the trends regarding their health, as well as the services that they provide. And this is where standards which provide us with protocols for data collection, for analysis, and potentially for reporting by organizations can support these objectives. I've seen it mentioned in the Q&A discussion and previously from other speakers, remote sensing, for instance, satellite observation, other unmanned aircrafts, as well as in situ data collection, so in-field collection of data can all be standardized. And there is one example that I don't mention here on the slide, but it's been developed in the ISO Technical Committee on Wood, where a standard on measuring harvests in tropical forests has been developed, which makes use of remote sensing data. So we could continue on that path with developing more standards that make use of the plethora of new data that comes from satellite observation, among others, and make this data more available in order to support decision-making, including decision-making that is going to impact the progress on the national targets that member states in the EU will be working towards under the nature restoration law. By encouraging companies to restore nature, by providing this data, or by encouraging them to collect the data, then we indeed can contribute to the objectives of the nature restoration law. But we also think that this can create opportunities for new forms of funding or financing from the monitoring of ecosystem services. What I mean by that is payment for ecosystem services are, well, the concept exists for a long time now, but one part of the reason we have not seen them fully materialize is that there is difficulty in gathering the data, and with tools like remote sensing, with the harmonization of other data collection systems, we can better have the information that indeed will support understanding of the improvement of ecosystem services and potentially reward the managers of the land, so maybe the farms that are improving the state of these ecosystem services. So building the business case for collecting the data and restoring nature. We have developed a short set of recommendations for standardizers, as indeed we see an opportunity here. And our recommendations revolve around a few key themes. The first one being that standardizers should really aim to provide added value, meaning not reinvent the wheel, but provide standards where there are gaps. And I think we can start with what already has been tried and tested. For instance, tools that have been developed and applied in the scientific literature. We've heard also from Caroline about eDNA, for instance, that's being developed as a standard. That's a very useful emerging tool to understand the presence of species in an ecosystem. There are some existing frameworks. I mentioned the science-based targets for nature a bit further down, and one advantage of those frameworks is that they can be complemented by specific standards in order to increase the level of or the quality of the data that can be used in or setting targets and reporting on companies' progress on their targets. We would also encourage that the data that is collected through new standards be open and reported publicly in order to support further scientific research and decision-making by not only the companies themselves, but their stakeholders. We also encourage that standards make good use of the potential for the data to be third-party verified, that the standards be interoperable with existing frameworks or with emerging frameworks. And again, here mentioning the Science-Based Targets for Nature initiative, that they are holistic. Of course, biodiversity is a very important topic, but it's part of the so-called triple planetary crisis, which is composed of climate and pollution as well as biodiversity. So we think that these should be integrated. The lessons that we can draw from some of the climate mitigation approaches is that if you try to address climate emission or carbon emissions in a sort of silo approach, you risk missing out on other issues. So yeah, not only those other environmental issues, but also social aspects, as well as the economy. So all of this should be integrated if we want to be successful. And lastly, the data provided through new standards should support decision-making and should be actionable. And that is something that we see as an important also criterion for effective standards. This is actually the end of my presentation. Thanks for listening, and look forward to engaging in the Q&A if there's any questions. Thank you. Do we still have a host in the webinar?
Hello, sorry, I was speaking, but I was muted. So I was thanking you, Sami, for your presentation. And I was telling also the audience that I've noticed that Caroline is willing to answer one of the questions. So if it's okay for you all, then I read out a question and Caroline can submit the reply orally, of course. So someone is thanking you for the interesting presentations. Also mentioning that there is an interesting slide with the interaction with the other TCs, but the person is just a little bit surprised to see that water quality has a certain distance and no overlap. In CEN, it's the EN 16859, water quality monitoring the freshwater pearl mussel is a standard which target biodiversity to a considerable degree, I think he says. So I hope there will be more examples in the near future. Caroline, would you like to say more about this? Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the question, and I thank you for this mention of this EN on water quality. The fact that we are in liaison with the technical committee at the ISO level, but we are starting the exchanges and discussion with the the technical committee at the European level. So it's a step-by-step process, and I'm pretty sure that this one you mentioned could be part of something to consider, as well as it's monitoring the water quality. Yeah, thank you for this. For the reference.
Okay, thank you, Caroline. Is anybody else seeing a question that he or she would like to reply? Please feel free to step in. We just in the moments that you read the questions through, I would just like to remind the audience that we're recording this webinar, so you will receive the link to the recording as well as the complete presentation in your inbox later today. So you can share with interested colleagues or partners if you would like to. I see Sami raised his hand, so please, Sami, go ahead.
Who else? I just see a question from Lucia that asks how scientific progress will be integrated into standards. I think that's a very important question that we need to constantly watch out for, meaning it's really important that to an extent scientists can be involved in standardization processes. In some technical committees, we do see some scientists, and therefore they can bring in their knowledge and expertise. I'm also thinking, as Benjamin mentioned, that the expert group that has been established for the nature restoration law implementation, in our view, as an NGO, should also involve scientists to the extent possible. And it's also the role of the technical committee experts and the expert groups for the NRL to also go and, well, ensure that where there is emerging science, that it is brought up as a discussion point in the committees and the groups for possible standardization.
Okay, thank you, Sami. I hope that replies Lucia's concern there. If you don't mind, I would like to launch a feedback poll. So it's a poll that we like to launch to all the attendees of our webinars, just with 3 small questions. And the answers of to the questions allow us to improve our webinars in the future. So if the attendees can just quickly reply these questions, that would be helpful for our future. Thank you. Okay, I see that Caroline is typing an answer to one of the questions, so thank you for that. In the meanwhile, on the last slide, I also have listed a few of our upcoming webinars. So as promised, you will receive the presentation in your inbox later today. So these hyperlinks allow you to register for one of the webinars, should these be of interest for you. If you are not free at that moment, we always also share the recording if you registered to our webinar. So that might be nice to know as well, in case you cannot make it the day itself. I noticed that it's a quarter to 3, so that's actually on the planning the moment that we plan to close down the webinar. So if it's okay for everybody, I would close down the webinar here. And as promised, I will send you all a follow-up email with the information in relation to this webinar. So thank you very much to the speakers. Thank you very much for all attendees that stayed until the end. Please fill in the feedback poll if you haven't done that yet. And then I wish you a very nice day. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.